All right, hello. Welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick, and with me, as always, is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right.
I think we both have the light hoodie going today. I think we both are wearing we coordinated an outfit somehow, not unintentionally.
Not unintentionally?
Not. I think I was deciding between saying unintentionally and not intentionally.
And you went with
just kind of went with both.
Yeah,
hey, okay. Most languages, the double negative is valid. It's for some reason in English, we don't do the double negative typically.
Well, I mean, I guess it's valid. It's just redundant, or it's just it's a harder way to say something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think if you said don't not do that, do not do that, that would typically cancel out in English.
Yeah.
But in other languages, if something is negative, you keep it negative through the whole version. Like in Spanish, they have a version of also which is positive, and they have a version of also which is negative. So if you're
suggest that things like this are why the rest of the world is having to learn English, not us all learn Spanish.
Oh, because we like to cancel out our negatives? I think it adds to confusion.
I don't think so. I think mathematically it makes more sense.
Maybe that's true.
Right.
The old, if you hate to hate, you love. How do they teach?
Well, you multiply multiplying. A negative times a negative is a positive.
Exactly. That's the whole idea. If you hate to hate, or if you love to hate, how do they teach that in other? Does that? If you are a foreign language speaker, we would like to know how they teach in other countries the multiplication of positives and negatives and the division. So feel free to write us in with that.
Sure. Let us know.
Because I need to know, because in schools here in the States, they teach it by saying like a negative means hate and a positive means love. So a negative times a negative means a positive because it's if you hate to hate, you love. If you remember.
I got to be honest, so I never heard that, but
You've never heard that?
I'm going to roll with it. Yeah, sure. Have at it.
That sat with me for a while. Because I thought about that philosophically too. It really was a moment for me.
Yeah, and I would argue it's not quite true. If you hate to hate, doesn't mean you go all the way to love. You could just be neutral.
You end up in the middle.
Yeah, you just
so a negative times a negative is zero.
Maybe you love to be neutral then, and so is that
some form of love there?
That's a path we'll save for.
It's a good thing you didn't learn this in school, because you would have been asking that at that point.
I would have been all over the place.
Wait, what do you mean if you hate to love, you hate? I guess maybe if you hate to love, maybe you don't go all the way to hate.
Well, if you hate to hate, I don't think that means you automatically love.
I think if the only one that works is if you love to love, you love.
Yeah.
And if you love to hate, I guess that works too. So the negative times the positive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That maybe. All right. Well, with that aside, let's begin today with Genesis 2:16 and 17. We'll read it real quick. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying that you may surely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day that you eat of it, you shall surely die.
Back to back shall surely.
Yes. All right. So this passage we're going to look at for the next 5 episodes here. In our typical fashion, where we take our time with these things. So we're going to look more at what I think we really should take away from these verses in the coming episodes. But for this first episode, I want to just look real quickly here at what other people in the past have sort of taken from these particular episodes, what kind of commentaries are out there and exist. All right. Particularly the idea of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Since the earliest Jewish commentators, we've seen this kind of described as, in terms of what this gives to the man and the woman. We've seen everything from the idea of it creating sexual awareness, which is obviously tied to the nakedness that we see that they realize at that point, to moral discrimination, to moral responsibility. What exactly is suddenly imparted mystically upon these two from this fruit, right? Now, one of the problems with this is that the story does not exactly make that particularly clear. This is once again that sort of this story allows for a range of interpretations, if you will. And to that end, by the way, I think that that can give us, again, a window into our own tendencies in life, our own tendencies towards sin, depending on how we interpret these things. I mean, I feel like that's sort of obvious when it comes to the sexual awareness thing. Perhaps that was the particular sin that those, who suggested that interpretation struggled with. But the approach we're going to take is not to sort of read into any particular like knowledge set suddenly being imparted upon the consumer of the fruit here. I think we're going to kind of avoid that, as we have done all along, and just focus on, okay, well, what's actually being said here, right? Rather than trying to read in our own sort of take on these particular things. So we're just going to look at what the story sort of tells us here about it, about what we see. But we'll save that for the coming episodes, and particularly more so in the next chapter when we get to the actual consumption of the fruit. So also here, though, there is in other interpretations, there's been some interesting speculation around the prohibition, why we're sort of, hey, don't eat this fruit, right? What was God doing? Why was God doing that? What was the plan here? So some people would argue that God was never going to let them eat the fruit of that tree. That was to remain the forbidden tree, and they would go on about their life in the garden, and that would be that. Others, not surprisingly, have gone to the complete other end of the spectrum and said, no, absolutely, they were going to be allowed to eat the fruit of that tree. It's just they needed to wait for when they were ready for it. But again, the story tells us neither. The story does not tell us, what God's supposed plan was, for this. And well,
there's so many different ways you can interpret this.
Of course.
I mean, you can interpret it as saying, like, is God speaking to someone as a child? You may surely eat of every tree, except for this one, because when you eat from that one, you're going to die. It's like, oh, is he behaving like a parent would with a kid, with saying like, oh, the costs of this are extreme, and so therefore you're gonna, but maybe then would God really lie like that? Would that be something? Okay, so maybe he's saying something where it's like, oh, he's saying you actually will die, and maybe there is some sort of death, and then we have to interpret and say, well, what died in the context of that?
Exactly. Yeah.
Is this an eternal prohibition? Does God have some sort of provision if they do eat from this tree? That'll be the so incredibly sparse. Of course.
Yeah, we're gonna narrow in on the death idea there specifically, because it's tough.
As a verse, though, it is. And even if you added context in around it, even if you read the verses around it, we can do that. But it's still incredibly sparse in terms of details. And it's very easy to interpret these things from a variety of angles. And you can kind of get away with it. Yes. Because you can kind of put up a decent argument as to say why this might be the case, and play with hypotheticals and things like that. What would have happened if they never consumed this? It's like, well, in the context of the story, they do.
Yeah.
So we kind of have to look at it through that lens. That's going to happen.
And that's what I want to get to here, is that actually that question of what if they didn't consume it, what was going to happen? I kind of think that is really only an interesting question if you're examining this story from the sort of the historical perspective, right?
Correct.
This is an actual event that happened and occurred like this, right?
Yeah.
And the reason being, because if you look at it that way, the moment of the fruit's consumption has a transformative effect on all of humanity, right? And so there it becomes a question of what ifs, right? But again, as we've said time and again in this show, we are taking a neutral stance to the historicity of things, right? Because I don't think these stories, at least, at this point in the Old Testament here, I don't think they demand to be taken as truth, as historically true, but they do demand to be taken as spiritually true. And so the spiritual truth can be in that story regardless of the historical fact, whether it occurred or not. The spiritual truth can be there either way, and so that's what we're really looking at. So yeah, we're focusing and asking what is the truth that the story reveals to us, regardless of the sort of unknowable answer to the question of whether it occurred or not. So this story generally, I think of it as how it's describing the relationship amongst God, man, and creation, and how that was meant to proceed, right? What was the initial idea in how all of this was meant to work together? And in this story, we discover, well, here's why it can't work that way. Here's how it's meant to work. Here's why it can't, right? And so to that end, we're treating it as a story full of the deepest of spiritual truths. And I would say that we're approaching it from a standpoint of being concerned with the spiritual what is, and not the what if that people are concerned with in the historical sense. One way to put this similarly is that no one looks at Lord of the Rings and asks, well, what would have happened if Smeagol hadn't found the ring at the bottom of the river, right? That's not, we don't spend our time considering that. Now that's fun, maybe, if you'd like to, I don't know, do some alternative fiction or something and tell us what would have happened, but that's not something that we think about normally when we think about that story. Or no one really asks what Harry Potter's life would have been like if his guardians there hadn't been stealing the letters that were being sent to him, right? We don't really speculate on that. And so here we're going to operate under the assumption that God has given us exactly as much of the story as we need to in order to understand the spiritual truth contained within the particular story. So the fact that he did not include something of a plan had Adam and Eve, had man and woman not consumed this fruit, means that doesn't matter. We don't need to know that information. There's no spiritual truth contained in that information, so why bother with that question?
I would contend that hypotheticals are the territory of the amateur, and I would even argue that in regards to historical study too. When I studied history in college, and that was prohibited, is playing out scenarios of alternate history. However, if I talk with anyone, if I talk with anyone who are fans of history and maybe didn't go into like rigorous study of it, but really kind of like history, and they like teasing around with it and stuff like that. First of all, they always like World War II. That's like standard. Every single person will always be like, "Oh man, World War II is my favorite," and I'm like, that's weird to be your favorite. Millions of people died, but still. But they will. They will always talk about alternate histories. Like, what if this happened? What if this happened? What if this happened? And the whole point is like, no, the idea is to understand the way in which the world functions. So you need to understand
that's what
why
you're studying
this
history for.
did happen.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking at this, you don't need to ask the alternate of what would have happened in this context. If we're saying there's deep spiritual truths in the series of events that did take place, which I think, regardless of if you have a historical perspective, you would argue that that there are deep spiritual truths within this. You need to not play the game of the amateur, but take the story very seriously and say, what actually happened? Let's play out that scenario and understand intimately that reason. Exactly. Yeah. It's fun to those are, like I said, I think it's the difference between the amateur and the professional. It's the person who's taking something serious. Well, in regards to seriousness, I will say, in regards to seriousness, if you're taking the task seriously, you're looking at the reality and saying, how do I understand this? Not how do I play around with what could have happened?
Yeah, I think the key is, what are you using the thing for, right? Are you using the history as something to
entertain?
Entertain in a way, or as a curiosity, maybe as something that clues you into something different than what the historian does. The historian looks at the the history to understand what actually happened and maybe try to get a sense of why it happened. Although I have my issues with how historians do that latter point as well. But
well, the modern reinterpretations, well, you have to
no,
historians run into the same issue that you're probably even talking about here, in terms of they have to cut through their own perceptions. They have to cut through their own
lines of causality are often overlapping. Let's put it that way. There's often overlapping causality that at times some historians, not all, but some historians perhaps narrow down a little too much in my terms of in my sense in terms of calling certain things the causal factor.
That's certainly possible, and that's why it's open for debate. That's why the avenue of the, I'll say the more serious, I guess, as opposed to professional and amateur, but the more serious individual is reality, because it is inexhaustible in terms of how complicated it can potentially be.
Right.
Whereas if you introduce then alternates into that, it's like, well, that's a waste of your time. That doesn't get you any closer to reality.
If it's for pure entertainment, then sure.
Correct. And that's why like History Channel loves doing that.
Right. Right. Exactly. So if it's for entertainment, that's one thing. But if it's this type of a situation where here I would argue, I mean, yes, if you're going for pure entertainment with the Bible, then go ahead, go down that path. What God might have done if they didn't eat the fruit in this way. But for those of us looking to actually use this story as it was meant to for the spiritual truth, then there's no reason to bother with that. So we're going to leave aside that particular question. So I just wanted to review those couple of basic things that are often discussed in relations to this particular part of the story and the tree itself, and explain that even though those things are regularly discussed, we're going to sort of sidestep that altogether, because as you were pointing out, I don't think it serves the purpose of what we should actually be looking at these stories for. So all right, so next episode what we're going to do is we're going to start to break down the whole tree thing that's here, and consider what this tree really signifies based purely on what the story has revealed to us. And we may consider what comes ahead as well, because, we're reading it in the context of the full story. We're following it, chronologically here, verse by verse, but we're aware of the full story. Let's put it that way. After that, we'll consider the matter of death as the consequence for this. So we'll look at that in the episode following. After that, we're going to spend one episode, again, coming back a little more closely to the tree, but looking specifically at what consumption of this fruit really symbolizes about humanity and sin, and better understanding the nature of a concept like morality. And then to wrap up these verses, the final episode is going to address the question of whether or not these verses are describing a covenant between God and man, or maybe not. And that sounds like a minor detail, and it sounds like maybe being a little pedantic. But I think the answer to that is going to offer both a case you're not likely to hear in many churches, and will also explain the potential negative impact that perceiving this incorrectly can lead to. So we'll examine that in the very last episode covering these verses. So that's a new addition. I figured if we're going to spend this many episodes on a verse, perhaps we should give you an episode breakdown of what you got to look forward to. So be sure to like, subscribe, make sure you hit any notification things that are necessary to make sure you get this episode whenever it comes. Leave a review, a rating, comment, email us unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you in the next one.